Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amita Vide from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and this is a module on poverty and exclusion as part of the paper on community organization. Now within this module, we will really try to understand the conceptual dimension of poverty and exclusion, which are two extremely critical concepts in the context of community practice. We will also try to understand the interrelationships of these two concepts and also the differences in how they have evolved. Poverty, something which has been ever present in India, it has now acquired several new facets. It's also entering new spaces and assuming really new forms. On the other hand, if you look at social exclusion, this is a perspective which really gained currency after 1996 and the International Social Summit. Now, social exclusion focuses on the processes which produce disadvantage and poverty. So in some ways, these are related concepts, and community work is actually required to address the imperatives and the challenges thrown to us both by poverty as well as social exclusion. The entire debate on what is poverty and whether society should be acting upon poverty was something which was resolved in the context of the UK, as we saw in 1834 and so on and so forth. When several countries, including India, became newly independent in the late 20th century, there was a different context of poverty which was being presented, and which was basically that it was the nation itself which was being seen as poor. So India was being seen as a poor country, and therefore evidently it was that action on poverty and who should take action on poverty, at what scale should one take action on poverty, these were debates which were being seen in a very different light. Okay. Speaking and before moving to these action points, I think it's important to look at how poverty is defined conceptually, how it was understood conceptually. And a large part of this definition is largely revolving around economic lenses. Within economic lenses, the two particular questions which have really been important in economic analysis is A, what is a poverty line? Who is poor? But for who is poor, from an economic point of view, that gets defined much more by what is poverty. And here food has remained a very important metric. That is because you define and understand poverty as a basic point of survival, the basic level of survival. And then the second question is, how do you measure this? And here, in terms of food, the entire aspect has revolved around what is the expenditure which is necessary to meet a daily dietary allowance, perhaps counting for and discounting for a small allowance for non-food goods. So there are huge debates in this area, whether food alone is enough to be qualified as a welfare metric or whether that welfare metric itself needs to be expanded. There are also debates about so what else to be included, whether you look at education, should we look at occupation, and the second aspect is how do you measure those metrics. Going back and trying to understand poverty, poverty emerged as a social problem really in the 16th century, and we can link this some of these earliest debates as to what was poverty and why and what does society owe to the poor. These are debates which began with the emergence of the Poor Law in the UK, and there was this entire report of 1834 which tried to define who is poor in the context of Great Britain and the overall crisis of industrialization which happened there. One of the main things in all of these reports and understandings of poverty is that basically you define poverty in terms of food, and it becomes the commodity of choice in saying who does not have food. So poverty initially, minimally, has been thought of as the phenomenon where people do not have the basics for survival, and then within that it starts with food. And therefore in recent years there have been a lot of debate about the welfare metrics which can be used to A, define the poverty line, and B, then also define really what does society owe to the poor. A very interesting expansion of this welfare metric in recent years has been the one which has been done by Amartya Sen, because what Amartya Sen talks about is to not look at poverty only in terms of survival, but he basically adopts a human capabilities approach, assuming that every human being has a certain potential, and therefore poverty is that process, poverty is that phenomenon which restricts and becomes a barrier, a lack of freedom which prevents human beings from attaining that potential. So this is a considerable expansion of the entire metric of the poverty line itself, something which began from the thinking of survival to bring it down to looking at, bring it up to thinking about opportunities and thinking about human potential itself. There are multiple conceptualizations of poverty, and the sociological analysis of poverty in particular begins with a lot of discussion about Oscar Lewis, who studied poor slum communities in Puerto Rico and gave us the concept of culture of poverty. Now, the culture of poverty is a concept which is based upon largely the observation that the situation of poor people remains the same despite economic transformations. Therefore, one begins to understand what Oscar Lewis particularly observed is that how children of the poor acquire the traits of how poverty will also be intergenerationally transmitted in some ways. Okay. The other big debate in relation to concepts of poverty has been whether social structures are important in producing poverty or whether it is individual agency in determining who is poor. And this debate is something which has taken multiple shapes through multiple kinds of conceptualizations of poverty. What is, however, today accepted is basically that poverty is multidimensional and that it includes both non-economic and also vulnerability indicators, and that's a considerable advance really which has been taken. In terms of action against poverty, if we have to take an overview, again this has been really based on the theorization. So what are the different kinds of emphasis that we see? That sometimes there have been individual focused programs thinking about poverty as an attribute of particular people, particular persons, and therefore you need to give incentives to individuals. You create programs which are individual based. On the other hand, there have also been mass based programs because of the persistence of and the observation of mass poverty in programs like in contexts like India. And you also see behavior change programs which believe that poverty is caused and is a result of particular kinds of behaviors. So you see that for a very long time we didn't have poverty redressal programs because there has been a very strong colonial legacy against initiating these kind of programs, and which were largely seen if you do development then basically you have countered poverty. So development, seeing development as the best medicine against poverty. On the other hand, after 1960s, when it was observed that while development efforts were on, poverty still persisted and was perhaps also increasing and presenting itself in many different ways. So then there started many mass poverty programs, and which took the form of large scale employment programs. And then in 1970s, with Garibi Hatao, there began a more comprehensive approach to poverty redressal in India in the form of the Integrated Rural Development Program, or IRDP. I will not get into how IRDP has really evolved, but I would basically say that in recent times this approach has again changed, and you will see that the focus now is really on microfinance, financial inclusion, and also empowerment. At the same time, schemes like Manrega, which are actually about creating mass employment opportunities, is also considered like a direct attack on poverty. While all of this is the evolution of rural poverty redressal programs, you basically see that urban poverty was really recognized very late, somewhere after 1985 and the 7th five-year plan. This is also because urban areas are seen to be seeds of prosperity. So it was very inconceivable for policymakers to think that poverty can also exist in cities. But after 1985, there is like a spate of programs at the national level on urban poverty. To give an example, Nehru Rozgar Yojana in 1986, which gave way to the Suvarna Jayanti Shahari Swarozgar Yojana, or SJSRY in 1997, to the more contemporary National Urban Livelihood Mission, which has been initiated 5 years ago. What we see today is really that poverty is becoming more urban, and added to it is the entire threat of climate change, which is adding new dimensions to the entire nature and experience of poverty. So with this discussion of poverty, how it has evolved, how policy with respect to poverty has evolved, what are the new dimensions of it, we will go to the concept of social exclusion. The concept of social exclusion was first used in France, and then it became much more popular after the Social Summit in 1996. Lenoir, basically, who coined the expression, talked really about social exclusion in relation to specific groups who were excluded, social groups who were excluded. And after the Social Summit, then the attempt has been to apply the concept of social exclusion to the entire context of Global South. And this is important to understand, because in the context of Europe, in the context of the developed world, social exclusion was seen that there is this welfare state which has included almost everybody in society, but yet there are groups which remain out, and that's become the frame of social exclusion. Whereas in the context of Global South, there are other kinds of concerns which have emerged, and so the concept of social exclusion has also taken on new forms. For example, in Latin America, it has been used in the context of rising inequality and the concerns around race and ethnicity. Or in China, it has been used in the context of harmonious social relations within society. Naila Kabir in 2000 took a systematic review of the way in which the concept of social exclusion has been applied in the Global South, and says that it has been used to either refer to problematic groups or problematic conditions or problematic processes. Sukhdev Thorat took an even sharper view, and he says that there are two dimensions of this concept which are extremely critical. One is talking about institutions and institutionalized exclusion, and the second is the outcomes, which are also extremely critical in terms of how do we see social exclusion. Sen brings in another dimension which is fairly nuanced, but which is that of making a distinction between active exclusion and passive exclusion. So active exclusion is when institutions are discriminating directly, whereas passive exclusion really happens when institutions and processes don't cognize differences and therefore become excluding. And I think this is a very, very critical distinction as well. We need to understand that when we talk about social exclusion, we need to also think about inclusion. And the relationship between these is a very interesting thing, because the consideration of inclusion actually helps us to nuance the discussion of exclusion and to begin to think of what are the modes and processes by which exclusionary outcomes are actually generated. So beginning to think about these kind of processes, Naila Kabeer talks about 3 such processes. One, she talks about institutional bias. Okay? So we can think about how banks in many cases are oriented towards regarding men as earners, and therefore there are many men who get benefits of credit programs as opposed to women. This is just one example of a institutional bias. One is biased against women entrepreneurs per se. The second is social closure. Now social closure is somewhere where communities systematically are perpetuating practices which do not allow benefits to reach particular sections. And the third dimension that she points out is that of unruly practices. Now this unruly practices is a very critical one, especially in the context of the way in which I would say post-colonial societies in developing countries like India have evolved, because these are some things which are not related in rules, okay, but these are basically practices. So you may have a constitution which may be very much for equity and equality, but on the other hand, the ways in which things are being done, you will basically see that they may be going or even contravening perhaps the envisagement of the constitution itself. Okay. As a trend, if one is to basically see how policies towards poverty and social exclusion have evolved, one will basically see that in India we have shifted from more generalized poverty redressal policies to more targeted ones. Sometimes these targets have taken also the form of identifying those who are the most poor on the basis of income parameters as well. We also see another trend where the scope of affirmative action, which is earlier limited to particular groups, has now been expanded. And now we begin to also include Muslims, minorities, other backward castes. So there is a different now emerging understanding of social exclusion even in this context. Arjan Dehan, who has pursued a whole lot of studies in relation to social exclusion, reviewed several policies in Orissa and Bihar. He basically identifies that in both of these states, one sees that social exclusion is really a product and a process of the gaps in governance, and how these governance processes do not acknowledge in multiple ways the differences which exist among people. So he raises many new questions, and which include the fact which include questions about whether there can be generalizations which can be made about who is excluded, who is more poor, or whether this requires an understanding of localized context to which generalized policies do not do justice. How have we used in India the concept of social exclusion and translated it into policy. What one sees is that from the overall notion of the nation as being generally poor, we went into targeted programs of poverty. We also have translated then notions of social exclusion, which at the beginning of independence were limited to affirmative actions for particular groups in the country, and we have expanded those. So what has happened? On one hand, we have basically expanded the entire scope of affirmative action. It has been extended to now Muslims, to minorities, to other backward castes, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, as Arjan Dihan does in his review of policies in Orissa and Bihar for nearly a decade, what he basically observes is that policies are blunt, policies are blind, they are insensitive to local context, and therefore they do not alter social relations at all. So what happens is exclusion remains intact. While there are schemes which are being delivered, the overall structure of exclusion remains. A similarly important area which is very, very relevant for us in India is that Naila Kabir's entire analysis and pointing out that social exclusion in contemporary India is not just related to the entire presence of social absences and social closedness, but it is also linked to the presence of unruly practices. So what this means is that you may have schools which are existing, whose purpose is to actually give opportunities, to include. But if you have school teachers who are absent, okay, this actually means that there are unruly practices which are happening. Or you visit primary health centers from where you are expected to get a supplement, let's say through the Janani Suraksha Yojana, where pregnant mothers, to be delivered mothers, are expected to get monetary assistance. But instead, in order to get that monetary assistance, you are expected to make an illicit payment to a health worker. Now, this kind of an illicit practice is something which in fact does more harm. So, on one hand, Dehan is talking to you about how social exclusion and the structures remain intact. Naila Kabir takes us further to actually say that some of these structures are doing more harm, and therefore we need to begin to see how does one counter these practices, because they are in the realm of practices. These are not rules which have been countered, they are not codified. So how does, and this, the challenge to them becomes much more difficult, and this is a challenge to both action and to policy at multiple levels, and actually these perhaps are going to be the core of the concern. What is poverty? What is its relationship to multiple forms of social exclusion, and the processes by which these social exclusions are created are central concerns really, therefore, for development workers and for community practitioners. So this is a very, very complex arena. Both poverty and social exclusion are large-scale phenomena, societal phenomena. These are concepts which have not emerged in the global south, but these are very, very relevant to the overall context of the global south. We should also remember that for practitioners per se, that the poor and the excluded should be at the center of any community practice effort. This has to be a principle, this has to be a focus of community work per se. The other relevance of this is basically what are the sites at which we deal with this. Policy deals with exclusion at a very large level, but what many of the current studies are bringing home to us is that there is a huge place for micro work and meso work, and these are largely the sites where you understand the complexity and the intersectionality of how disadvantage actually occurs. And community workers and community practitioners can actually contribute to policy voids by enabling bridging gaps, pioneering new policy models, by becoming very, very nuanced and relevant to these micro and meso sites. For references, you have to basically look at Naila Kabir. You should look up Sukhdev Thorat. In terms of looking at poverty literature, there is a whole lot. So therefore, perhaps looking at the text and using and following up on some of the references through that text would become important. Thank you.